The apartment above the framer's shop smelled of linseed oil and cold wax, and Helena Ainsworth had arranged the table herself. One glass, one small pastry from the boulangerie 3 streets over, and a single candle she had lit without ceremony at precisely 7:30. She was wearing the amber silk she had bought in the Marais the previous autumn, the one with the narrow sleeves and the row of jet buttons she had fastened herself because there was no one to ask. She had not told her maid to wait up. The Seine was audible through the glass when the wind turned, and 3 canvases leaned drying against the far wall. A study of the market at dawn, a stand of irises in a green vase, and something larger she had not yet decided the name of. Helena sat, lifted the wine, and raised the glass to her own reflection in the dark window. Not a toast to grief, not to absence. Simply to the woman looking back at her, who had finally, after 10 years of waiting for a carriage that never came, stopped setting a second place at the table. Then, below, the sound of wheels on the cobbles. Then, a door opening. Then a tall figure stepping down from a hired carriage, his coat rumpled from travel, a wrapped parcel held in one hand, the kind of parcel an anxious housekeeper presses on a man at the last possible moment, as if the paper and ribbon might repair whatever the journey cannot. He stood on the pavement in the lamplight and looked up at her lit window. Helena set down her glass. 11 weeks earlier, she had been standing in the long gallery of Marbury Hall at 7 in the morning, already wearing her traveling coat. The gallery was cold in a way that English houses in March are always cold. Not the cold of a room left unheated, but the cold of a room that has absorbed 3 centuries of stone and will not give it back regardless of what the fireplaces do. The ancestors hung in their gilded frames the length of the room, and at the far end, on the console table beneath the last window, stood the evidence of the previous evening. 4 candle stubs burned to their bases, a wine glass with the dregs dried to a ring, and a small arrangement of white flowers Helena had cut from the hothouse and placed there herself. She had eaten alone at the long table in the dining room, read until 10, and gone to bed at 50:30. She had not cried. She had not expected to. The expectation, that specific, hopeful, foolish expectation that the 10th year might be different from the 9th, had left her somewhere around the 8th anniversary without much ceremony, and what remained in its place was something quieter and considerably harder. She heard Gabriel's footstep before she saw him. He came through the far door at the end of the gallery, still in his traveling coat, his hair not yet combed, and he stopped when he saw her standing there, in her fitted gray jacket, with the small trunk behind her. "Helena," he said. "Good morning," she said. He looked at the candle stubs on the console table. Something moved across his face, not precisely guilt, but the recognition of guilt, which is its own particular expression. He crossed the gallery toward her slowly, his hands at his sides. "Are you angry?" he asked. Helena considered the question with the same attention she gave to problems of color and light, which was to say she looked directly at it and did not look away. "No," she said. "I'm not angry. Being angry would require that I still expected you to do better, and I stopped expecting that some years ago. The anger ran out when the expectation did. They left together." Gabriel was quiet for a moment. "When does your train go?" 8:15. He put his hand on the back of one of the gallery chairs, not gripping it, just resting his fingers there, as though he needed something solid. "I was in the chambers until past midnight," he said. "The Ellison matter has gone to full hearing. I should have written to you. I know I should have written." "You should have come home," Helena said, and she said it without heat, which was worse. "But that is a different conversation, and I am not certain it is one we have time for this morning, or that I have the appetite for it at present." She lifted her traveling bag from beside the trunk and set it by the door. Her maid, Marguerite, appeared at the far end of the gallery with the second case, and Helena nodded to her. "How long will you be in Paris?" Gabriel asked. "I don't know that I'm coming back," she said. The gallery was very quiet. Outside, a cart passed on the gravel drive. "Are you—" he began, and stopped, and began again, more carefully. "Are you leaving me, Helena?" She turned and looked at him directly, and what she said next she had not planned to say. It came from somewhere below planning, from a place that had been filling quietly for years and had finally reached the brim. "You left first?" she said. "The spring we married Clara off to Mr. Hartley, and you spent the whole of April in London on that drainage matter, and came home in May and told me you'd been terribly occupied. That was 10 years ago. I've spent 10 years being graceful about an absence you never noticed you'd caused. I've been very good at it. You never noticed that either." Gabriel did not argue. She had not expected him to. He stood with his hand on the chair back and looked at her with the expression of a man who has just understood the floor plan of a house he has lived in for 30 years and found a room he did not know was there. "Helena," he said. "I'll write to Clara and Tobias," she said. "I won't trouble anyone at the hall." She walked past him toward the door, and he did not stop her, and the candle stubs on the console table stood in their cold silver holders, and the ancestors watched from their frames with the perfect indifference of people who have been dead long enough not to take sides. Within the week, she was gone. 2 trunks, her brushes, 4 prepared canvases, and Marguerite, who had been with her since before Clara's wedding, and who understood, without being told, that this journey was not a visit to cousins. Helena wrote to Clara from Dover and to Tobias at his station. Brief, warm letters that said she was going to Paris for an extended stay, and that she was perfectly well, and that they were not to worry. She wrote nothing to Marbury Hall. The apartment on the Rue de la Seine was one she had kept for 4 years, sublet from a widow who wintered in the south and asked no questions. It was on the first floor above Monsieur Beaumont's framing shop. 2 rooms and a long north-facing window that gave onto the rooftops and a strip of gray river in the middle distance. It smelled of the shop below. Linseed oil, rabbit skin glue, the faint sweetness of gilded gesso. Helena had always found it a working smell, which was to say, she found it a comfort. She hung her coat on the hook beside the door, the same hook she always used, and Marguerite unpacked the brushes into the blue jar on the window sill. And Helena stood in the middle of the room and looked at the north light coming in across the floor. She did not feel like a fugitive. She did not feel like a woman in the middle of a catastrophe. She felt, with a precision that surprised her, like a woman who had come home to a place she had made herself, piece by piece, over 4 years. And that this time she had come to stay in it rather than visit it. She opened her paint box. She set a fresh canvas on the easel. She mixed a gray-green for the river and began. Gabriel finished the penultimate spring hearing in the Court of Chancery on the 14th of April and boarded the evening packet from Dover with his overnight case and a parcel his housekeeper had pressed into his hands as he left. Wrapped in brown paper, tied with ribbon, a thing she had found in the study that looked like it might be a gift. He had not told her what it was. He was not entirely certain himself. He arrived at the Gare du Nord at 9:30 in the evening, hired a carriage, and gave the driver the address on the Rue de la Seine that he had taken from the letter Helena had written Clara. Clara, who had forwarded it to him with a single line of her own, appended at the bottom, "Papa, I think you ought to go." The carriage stopped below the framing shop. Gabriel stepped down onto the cobbles, the parcel under his arm, and looked up at the first-floor window. A lamp burned behind the glass. He could see the shape of a woman in an amber dress, seated at a table. And for a moment, she was perfectly still. And he stood in the street below her with the noise of Paris around him and understood, in a way he had not managed to understand in 11 weeks of letters and distance, that the window above him was not a window in his house. It was a window in hers. He waited. After some minutes, the door of the shop opened and a young woman came out, Helena's maid. He recognized her. And she said quietly and without apology that Madame was not at home. Gabriel looked up at the window. The lamp was still burning. The woman in amber had not moved. He stood on the pavement for some time after the maid had gone back inside. A lamplighter came along the street with his pole, lit the lamp at the corner, glanced at the tall Englishman standing in the road, and moved on. Gabriel looked at the parcel in his hands. Then he looked up at the window once more. Then he put the parcel back under his arm and walked back to the carriage and told the driver to take him to a hotel. He had come on the right night for once. It was, he understood, the wrong night for that to matter. Upstairs, Helena watched him go. She sat for a moment after the carriage had disappeared around the corner, and then she picked up her wine glass and drank the rest of it, and looked at the 3 canvases drying against the wall, and felt something she could not have named precisely. Not triumph, not grief, not relief. Something closer to clarity. She had not opened the door. She had not needed to. Spring came to Paris, in increments that April. A warm afternoon followed by a cold morning. The chestnut trees on the quay coming into leaf in fits and starts. The light off the Seine shifting from the flat gray of March to something more complicated and interesting. Helena painted better than she had in years. She could not have said precisely why, except that when there was no second person to account for, no dinner hour to observe, no social register to maintain, the hours arranged themselves around the work rather than around the work arranging itself around the hours. Monsieur Beaumont, the framer downstairs, a small, cheerful man of 60 with a ginger cat and opinions about varnish, had been selling her work for 3 years on a quiet, friendly basis. A botanical study here, a river view there. To the kind of Parisian buyers who purchased paintings because they liked them rather than because they were fashionable. That spring he brought a man named Vidal to see the irises in the market study. Vidal was thin, precise, and slow to speak, and he stood in front of the irises for 4 minutes without saying anything, which Beaumont told her afterward was a very good sign. He asked your name. Beaumont said. What did you tell him? She asked. What you put on the paintings, Beaumont said. Helena Voss. She signed them with her maiden name. She had done so from the beginning, without discussing it with anyone, the way one makes a decision that does not feel like a decision at the time, because it is simply the obvious thing. Her father had been a Dutch engraver, who had come to England with his tools and his eye and his unpronounceable name, and she had his eye and his patience with a difficult surface, and it seemed correct to say so. Gabriel wrote. The first letters were formal, short, careful notes that asked after her health and mentioned the weather at Marbury, and said very little else. She replied in kind. Then his letters became slightly less formal, not warm exactly, but less managed, as though the effort of maintaining a certain register over several weeks had begun to tire him. He did not mention the night on the pavement. She did not mention it either. He arrived without invitation in the second week of May, on a cold spring afternoon when the rain was coming in sideways off the river. Helena heard the bell at the street door and went to the landing at the top of the stairs and found him there, 2 flights below. Soaked through, his hat dripping, his coat dark with water. He was looking up at her with an expression she had not seen on his face in quite some time. Not the managed expression of a man conducting himself correctly, but the simpler expression of a man who has traveled a considerable distance in bad weather and is not entirely certain he will be let in. She did not invite him in. She allowed him the landing outside her door, which was dry and had a wooden bench against the wall. They stood on either side of the bench and spoke carefully about Clara, whose second child was expected in August, and about Tobias, whose ship had put in at Lisbon. The rain came down outside the window at the end of the landing. Water dripped from the brim of Gabriel's hat at intervals, and he did not remove the hat, perhaps because removing it would have been a gesture toward comfort, and he understood that comfort was not on offer. When he left, Helena watched him go down the stairs and out into the rain, and said nothing. But at his next visit, 10 days later, he arrived at a reasonable hour, dry, and rang the bell with the air of a man who has been thinking about how to ring a bell. She had placed his forgotten gloves on the bench outside her door. She had found them on the landing after he left, soaked through, and had washed them herself and left them to dry on the rack in the kitchen and rolled them with care and set them on the bench before he arrived. She did not mention them. He picked them up without speaking. It was the first thing of his she had touched in his presence in 3 months, and they both knew it, and neither said so. On his third visit, Gabriel sat on the bench and asked, after a pause in the conversation about Tobias's letters, a question that had nothing to do with the children or the estate or any of the practical matters he had been using as scaffolding. "What are you working on?" he asked. Helena looked at him. He was looking at the door to the apartment, not at her, at the door, as though the question had come out before he was ready for it to. "You've never asked me that before," she said. "I know," he said. She did not answer, but she did not close the door either, and she remained on the landing for another quarter of an hour. And when he left, there was something fractionally different in the air of the landing, like a window opened a half-inch in a room that has been shut all winter. On the fourth visit, they walked. It was a warmer afternoon, the light on the river the particular gold of late May, and Helena had decided, without announcing the decision, that the landing was becoming a habit she was prepared to modify. They walked along the Quai de la Seine from the shop to the bridge and partway back, and Gabriel talked, with some difficulty, about the chancery hearings. Not specifics, but the texture of them. The way a winter in the courts sits in the shoulders and the back of the neck. He was 58, and it showed in the way it hadn't 5 years ago. He stumbled on a loose stone near the second bench, not badly, just a half-step sideways, the stumble of a tired man on uneven ground. And Helena's hand closed on his elbow before she had made any decision to move it there. She steadied him. Her hand stayed a moment past steadiness. Neither of them spoke about it. They walked back to the shop in the late afternoon light, and she went upstairs, and she stood at the north window with her hand still remembering the weight of his sleeve. Then Sophie arrived. Sophie was Gabriel's niece, the eldest of the three, 19 now, with her mother's quick mouth and her own considerable opinion of her right to travel without writing ahead. She appeared at the apartment door on a Tuesday morning with a single bag, and the information that she had come across on the packet because she had wanted to see Paris, and because Helena had always been her favorite aunt, which she delivered as a statement of fact, requiring no particular response. Helena made tea and put Sophie in the sitting room, and listened to her talk about the crossing, which had been rough, and about a young man she had encountered at the Calais customs office, who had been interesting, and about a hat she had seen in a shop window on the Rue de Rivoli that she intended to purchase before she left. And then, in the middle of a sentence about the hat, Sophie said, in exactly the same conversational tone. "Uncle Gabriel has been in the courts every spring, you know? All these years, he never stops." And then she went on talking about the hat. Helena set down her cup. She looked at the wall above Sophie's head, a botanical study of a white ranunculus that Beaumont had not yet taken down to the shop, and kept her expression in the same place it had been. "More tea?" she said. Sophie accepted with a nod. "Please." Helena poured. Sophie moved on to the question of whether the hat's ribbon was green or blue, which apparently mattered. Helena thanked her for coming. She sent her to the sitting room to rest after the crossing, and she stood in the hallway with the teapot still in her hand and stayed there for a long moment. The courts every spring, all these years. She could go back into the sitting room and ask Sophie to continue. Sophie would tell her. Sophie was 19 and fond of her, and would lay out the whole of it without hesitation if Helena asked her to. Helena put the teapot on the hall table and made her decision. She would not hear it from Sophie. Whatever Gabriel had been doing in those courts every spring, whatever had taken him away, year after year, on the exact dates that mattered, she would hear it from him, in his own words, with his own face in front of her. Or she would not hear it at all. What he became in her understanding would be built from his own accounting, not from his niece's summary, however kindly meant. She was still standing in the hallway when the storm came in. It arrived without much warning, the way spring storms in Paris do. A darkening of the sky to the southwest, then the wind off the river, then rain that came down hard and sudden and turned the Rue de la Seine into a channel. Helena, who had not slept well since Sophie's sentence about the courts, came downstairs at midnight for a glass of water and found the door to the framing shop ajar and a light burning inside. She pushed the door open. The shop smelled of gesso and wood shavings and the damp that had come in under the street door. Beaumont had evidently offered shelter to someone caught in the rain. Beaumont was that kind of man, and had gone back to bed without troubling himself about it, because the someone was now asleep on the narrow bench in the back room among the stacked gilded frames. His coat folded under his head, his breathing even. It was Gabriel. Helena stood in the doorway between the shop and the back room and looked at him for a moment. He was entirely asleep. The deep, unguarded sleep of a man who has been exhausted for a long time and has finally stopped moving. In the light of the single lamp on Beaumont's workbench, with the frame stacked around him like a gilded forest, he looked older than she usually allowed herself to notice, and also, somehow, less defended. She crossed the room. She took a polishing cloth from the bench, a soft flannel Beaumont used for the frames, and laid it over Gabriel's shoulders. Then she put her hand on his shoulder for one moment, briefly, the way you might steady something that might fall. He did not wake. His breathing did not change. She stood there for a few seconds longer than she had intended to, and then she went back upstairs. She never knew, going back to bed, whether he had been aware of her there. She told herself it did not matter. It mattered considerably. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from London. Gabriel had returned for the final chancery hearing, the one that would end it one way or another, and he had written ahead of it. The letter began correctly enough, but in the third paragraph it tipped into something she had not expected from him, a leaning. If you understood the weight of what I have managed these years, Helena, I believe you would find it possible to understand why the springs were as they were. I have not been idle. I have not been indifferent. There are things I have carried that you do not know. She read it twice. Then she took a sheet of paper and wrote one line, I will not be moved by nobility used as a wall. If you want to be understood, try being known. She sealed it and sent it. 2 weeks passed. Neither of them wrote. During those 2 weeks, word reached Vidal through the particular channel by which English county gossip crosses the channel. A letter to a business associate, a remark at dinner. The way a name travels when the people who know it are curious and the ocean between them is not as wide as it looks. The word that reached Vidal was this. Helena Voss was in fact the Countess of Marbury, living in Paris apart from her husband. Vidal was not a cruel man, but he was a careful one, and a woman at the center of a marital separation, an English countess no less, was a complication for a gallery that depended on the confidence of serious buyers. He sent a note. He was, the note said, reconsidering the timing of the exhibition. 4 years of work. The irises, the market study, the river series, the botanical plates that Beaumont had framed in plain gold because she had asked for plain gold, and he had agreed without argument. The first exhibition signed with her own name, the first public claim she had made on the life she had built here. And it was slipping. Not because of anything she had painted, but because of the marriage she had left. Helena read Vidal's note on a Thursday morning. On Friday morning she put on her good coat and walked to his gallery on the Rue du Bac. Meanwhile, in a corridor outside the Court of Chancery in London, Gabriel sat on a wooden bench with his solicitor standing beside him and heard the ruling. Full custody granted to the Earl of Marbury. The uncle's petition dismissed. The children, Sophie and the 2 younger ones, James and Nell, secured. 11 years of spring hearings, 11 years of careful, grinding, expensive legal work, finished in a single afternoon. His solicitor shook his hand. Gabriel thanked him. He sat on the bench for a while longer after the solicitor had gone, looking at the corridor floor. He had won. The children were safe. The uncle, who had wanted the guardianship for the income attached to the estate, and who had never, in 11 years of petitions, shown the slightest interest in the children themselves, was defeated. The thing Gabriel had set out to do when his sister died was done. And sitting in that corridor with the sound of the building around him, Gabriel understood, with the plainness of a man who has been honest with himself in small things for a long time, that he had won the wrong war. Not the wrong war for the children. They were safe, and that was right, and he would not take it back. But the wrong war for his marriage. He had fought 11 years for 3 children who were not his by blood, and had not fought one afternoon for the woman who was his by love and choice. And he had told himself, year after year, that protecting her from worry was a form of love, and had never once asked her whether she wished to be protected. He did not write to announce the victory. He packed his case and booked his passage to Calais. He arrived in Paris the following afternoon to find that the exhibition had already been saved, and his name was nowhere in the saving of it. Beaumont told him cheerfully, over a cup of coffee in the shop, that Helena had gone to see Vidal herself, that she had told him, apparently, that she was exactly the woman the gossip described, and that if he wanted honest paintings, he would have to hang an honest woman. That Vidal had looked at the canvases for a long time, and then said yes. Gabriel listened to this and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "When is the opening?" 3 weeks, Beaumont said. "Will you be here?" His voice was quiet. "If she allows it," Gabriel said. He came for the 5th time on an evening in early June, when the Paris light was doing what it does only in June, holding itself gold and level across the rooftops long past the hour when it should have gone. And Helena, for the first time, opened the door and let him in. He sat among the drying canvases in the chair she placed for him near the window, his hat in his hands, and looked at the work around him. She stood at the far side of the room. The lamp was burning low on the table. "What have you been painting?" he asked. "All these years, Helena, when I thought you were visiting cousins? What were you actually painting?" She looked at him. He was not asking about technique or subject or the practicalities of pigment and canvas. He was asking the question he had never asked in 28 years of marriage. What she had been doing in the rooms he had never entered. She crossed to the stack against the wall and turned one canvas toward him. It was the long gallery at Marbury. The ancestors in their frames, the cold light from the windows, the flagstone floor going back and back into the distance. And at the far end of the gallery, very small, her back half turned, a woman lighting candles. The candles were lit. The gallery was empty. There was no one coming. Gabriel looked at it for a long time. The lamp burned. Outside, the city made its evening sounds. "I owe you the truth," he said at last. He said it without preamble, without building toward it, in the tone of a man who has decided that the time for building toward things is finished. Not as an explanation, not as a defense, but because you have shown me something true and I will not meet it with anything less. He told her about his sister's death, about the uncle, a man named Carew, cold-eyed and patient, who had moved for the guardianship within a month of the funeral, who wanted the children's income and would have had it legally within a year if Gabriel had not contested it. About the Court of Chancery, which moves slowly and requires persistence and costs money and time. About 11 springs in London, each one falling in the same judicial term, each one falling on the same weeks. The weeks of their anniversary, the weeks Helena had spent alone at Marbury with the candles and the wine, and the second place unset. "I chose not to tell you," he said. "Each year I told myself the hearing might be the last, and that there was no reason to add the weight of it to you when it might resolve itself. And then it did not resolve, and another year passed, and the reason I had given myself had become a habit, and I had stopped examining it." He paused. Helena said nothing. "I told myself," he continued, "that you were strong enough not to need me there, that a woman of your character and capability did not require my presence to manage an anniversary, or a season, or a decade. I told myself this was respect." He set his hat on the table beside him. "I understand now that it was not respect. I decided for you. I decided what you needed, and what you could bear, and what you would forgive. And I made all those decisions without asking you a single one of them. And deciding for you, deciding that you were strong enough to be left, was its own way of leaving. I have known that since March. I wanted you to hear me say it." He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not mention the children as a reason she should understand. He sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the canvas of the long gallery and waited. Helena was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to hear the city outside the window. "Do you know what it is," she said, "to be gracefully left?" He said nothing. "It is not dramatic," she said. "It does not arrive with a scene or a quarrel. It arrives as a series of small absences, each one reasonable, each one explained, each one forgiven before it has finished happening. And you are graceful about it because you love the person, and because making a scene would be undignified, and because you tell yourself, as I told myself, year after year, that a great man has great demands on him, and that a good wife does not add to them." She stopped. "I became very good at it. I became so good at it that I stopped noticing I was doing it. I came to Paris and painted and found Beaumont and found Vidal and found my name on a canvas. And I told myself I was visiting cousins. I was very graceful about that, too. Gabriel was looking at her now. I stopped being graceful about it on the night of our 10th anniversary, she said, when I sat alone in this room and lit one candle and poured one glass of wine and understood that I had been arranging absences for so long that I had arranged my own. She let that stand. I am not going to forgive you tonight, she said. I may forgive you eventually. I do not know yet. But I will tell you what I know now. She crossed her arms, not defensively, but in the manner of a woman collecting herself for something that matters. I will not go back to Marbury. I will not go back to being the countess who visits Paris to paint, and then comes home to the gallery and the ancestors and the second place at the table. If there is to be a marriage, it lives here. In this apartment, in this city, in the life I built in the years you were building yours. You may come to it, I will not leave it. And we see each other plainly, what we are, what we've done, what the 10 years were. Or we see nothing at all. Those are my terms. Gabriel was quiet for a long moment. He answered simply, yes. It was not a capitulation. It was the word of a man who has finally understood the question and found, to his own surprise, that the answer is simple. They sat together in the lamplight among the drying canvases until the lamp burned low, and neither of them slept. And the night passed into the particular blue-gray of early dawn that comes over Paris rooftops in June, as though the city is turning a new page. Gabriel rose to leave. He picked up his hat from the table. Helena was standing by the window, the first light coming in across the rooftops behind her. Gabriel, she said. He stopped at the door. She looked at him for a moment, and then she asked him a question she had never asked in 28 years of marriage, in the same direct, unhurried way she had said everything else tonight. Do you know, she said, what I most want from the years I have left? He was quiet. He thought about the canvas of the long gallery, the small woman at the far end lighting candles in an empty room. He thought about the gloves rolled with care and left on the landing bench. He thought about her hand on his elbow on the quay. No, he said plainly, but I would very much like to learn. She crossed the room and kissed him once, slowly, with her hand on his sleeve. Not a return to something, a beginning of something, the first thing of its kind. The exhibition closed on a Saturday afternoon in late June, and Helena chose the guests herself. Sophie came, with the 2 younger wards, James, 15, and Nell, 12, who had never been to Paris and who stood in front of the river series with the focused silence of children who are trying to decide whether they are allowed to be impressed. Clara came from Bath, rounder now with the coming child, and embraced Helena at the door for a long moment without saying anything, which was unlike Clara and therefore said everything. Beaumont came with his wife, a tall woman who shook Helena's hand with both of hers. Vidal came and stood in front of the irises for precisely as long as he had stood in front of them the first time, which Beaumont said was a very good sign indeed. Gabriel was there. He stood near the window with a glass of wine, and he was present in the room in a different way than he had ever been present in a room in her life. Not as the Earl of Marbury who had accompanied his wife to a social occasion, but as a man who had been let into something and knew the value of the door. He did not stand at her side. He did not manage the room. He watched her move through it, talking to Vidal about the river light, answering Nell's question about how you make the color of water, accepting Clara's hand on her arm with a smile that was genuine and unguarded. And he was simply there, watching, as though watching her was something he intended to do for a long time and did not want to waste. On the wall, the paintings hung signed Helena Voss, and there was no enemy in the room to face down, no scandal to survive, no public moment of vindication. The vindication was the room itself. These people, this work, this city, this life she had built in the spaces where she had not been seen, now entirely visible and entirely hers. In the days that followed, Gabriel stayed. The apartment rearranged itself without discussion, the way practical things do when two people have decided to stop discussing and start living. A second easel appeared near the window, a smaller one borrowed from Beaumont, because Gabriel had confessed one morning that he had always wanted to try watercolor and had never permitted himself the time. Helena showed him, without ceremony, how to wet the paper and let the pigment find its own way. He was not gifted. He was patient, which is different. And patience with a wet surface is worth more than gift. His early attempts were earnest and slightly wrong in the way that first attempts always are. And Helena corrected them without indulgence and without cruelty, the way her father had corrected hers. His coat hung on the hook beside hers by the door. On a morning in July, the light coming in low and gold across the studio floor, Helena stood at the larger easel with a new canvas, the rooftops of Paris from the north window, the river in the middle distance, the sky doing something complicated with cloud and light that she had been trying to catch for 3 weeks. Gabriel sat at his smaller easel nearby, working at a study of the blue jar of brushes on the windowsill, which was within his current ability, and which he was approaching with the focused seriousness of a man who has decided to learn something and intends to mean it. He reached across without looking up and took the small brush she had loaded with blue, a particular gray blue she had mixed for the river, and added it to his jar study, and set it back in her hand without a word. The print of his thumb remained in the blue on her palette, pressed in clearly, the mark of a hand that had been here. Helena looked at the canvas in front of her. Then she took a fine brush, dipped it, and wrote in the lower corner, small and clear for the first time, Helena Ainsworth, Paris. The 10 years did not come back. There was no recovering them, no revision of what they had been. The cold gallery, the guttered candles, the one glass raised to a dark window. They had cost what they cost and would go on costing, the way permanent things do, but the morning light was on the rooftops, and the 2 easels stood side by side in it, and in the corner of the palette the blue held the shape of his thumb, and they began anyway.